Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, Consul 85, 84, and 82 BCE. Carbo is something of a forgotten man in the Marian Sullan civil war of the 80s. He inherited the faction that Marius had started and that Cinna had then taken to the height of its power, but he's often forgotten. Yet it was he, and not Marius or Cinna, who actually met Sulla on the battlefield to conclude the wars of the 80s. So in this video we're going to give Carbo his due and focus on his life and career. The annals of Roman history are not exactly crawling with people named Papirius Carbo. You're much more likely to encounter a Claudius Pulcher, for instance, than you are anyone with the last name Papirius. That being said, Carbo's branch of the Papiria gens, the Carbones, was at least clearly rich and well connected. His uncle had been Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. He had served as consul in 120, and there is also a Gnaeus Papirius Carbo who served as consul in 113, and I imagine this has to be the father of the subject of our video today. It is too much of a coincidence that his time as consul would put him at exactly the right age to be the father of someone who would be consul in the 80s. The Carbones branch does not seem to have achieved much distinction prior to Gaius's consulship in 120, but if they can sustain two consuls who are brothers, this means that the Carbones were doing quite well, and also that they must have had some considerable clout. It was not every family that could get two different brothers elected from the same generation. The traditional, i.e. conservative Roman interpretation of the late Republic, at least the specific set of years between the Gracchi and the triumph of Sulla in the late 80s, is that this period was dominated by demagogues who would use the office of tribune in order to stir up trouble and undermine the Senate's authority. This, of course, is the basic political message of Sulla and his successors, the so-called optimates. Carbo, of course, was most famous for being an opponent of Sulla, so it should come as no surprise that he was one of the so-called demagogues. Carbo served as tribune of the plebs in 92 BCE. He presided over a meeting of the assembly. We don't know exactly what he was trying to do, what kind of legislation he was proposing, or exactly how violence broke out. Most likely, if other events can be used as a guidepost, one of his colleagues tried to impose a veto and the crowd that was behind Carbo got angry. At any rate, Carbo did not press his claims as far as many other tribunes had in the past, since the Senate never saw fit to declare a senatus consultum ultimum against him. He had a rival as an orator, and as we'll see, Carbo is mostly famous for his oratory, Lucius Licinius Crassus, who was a senior man in Rome at this time, a conservative, and someone who clearly did not like Carbo's politics. At any rate, this Crassus went before the Senate and got them to pass a decree which placed the official blame for this disturbance in the forum on Carbo. 40 years later, Cicero found a copy of this decree, and that's the only reason we even know that Carbo was ever tribune of the plebs. Due to his notoriety as the last guy who opposed Sulla, his career is a bit murky, especially in its earliest phases, and this is a really good example of a chance survival in terms of historical information about someone who was sort of whitewashed out of history to some extent. With a lot of Romans who achieved prominence, we are not entirely sure what their specialty was. What was it about this person which made them special aside from their family name? For Romans who had military skills, it's pretty obvious, but in other cases it is less so. Fortunately, our good friend Marcus Tullius Cicero comes through for us once again, because he happened to have a very strong interest in the orators of his youth, and one of the men he had seen and ultimately learned from was none other than Carbo. Cicero was really impressed by Carbo's command of Latin, and especially his ability to get through tongue twisters and really difficult turns of phrase. In the mid-80s, when he rose to prominence, Carbo would have been a good deal younger than the typical consul, and that is probably due to his skill as an orator and the fame that garnered for him. It doesn't appear they had any military skill, so I assume that it was his oratory more than anything else, which helped to elevate him to the upper echelons of fame among his contemporaries. In 88, with the social war concluded, Rome entrusted Sulla, its best general during the social war, with the conduct of a war against Mithridates in Asia and in Greece. However, while Sulla was on the march out of Italy, Marius, the elderly general who had been such a hero 20 years before, went before the assembly and got the command transferred to himself. Sulla took ill to this, marched on Rome, and sort of reclaimed his command by force. After Sulla's departure from Italy, after a long tarry in the capital, Marius came out of hiding and tried to retake power. It was at this point that Carbo came forward as a strong supporter of Gaius Marius. However, the real power in the Marian faction was one of the consuls who had been elected when Sulla had presided over the elections, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Sulla had known that Cinna was not a friend of his, yet he had allowed him to stay in office, and for that, he ultimately deserves a lot of the blame for the civil war that would rage for the next 6 to 7 years. Cinna was someone who was much more politically savvy than the aging Marius, who even at his best had never been a good politician, and by this point was clearly suffering from some notable cognitive decline. Luckily for the Marian faction, in early 86, Marius finally died, and then Cinna was able to exercise full power without a rival. This meant that the path to power for the Marian/Cinnan faction lay through one man, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Carbo would therefore have to cozy up to Cinna, and as we'll see, he did just that. The Cinnan regime in Rome is quite odd, and I'll get into that in greater detail when I talk about Cinna, but basically what Cinna did is find a group of men he trusted and ensure that they got elected to the annual magistracies over and over and over. The problem with this, of course, is that there's not a lot of advancement, so whereas normally in Rome you rotate the offices so that way honors are distributed and men have an opportunity to fulfill their ambitions, Cinna basically created a kind of moratorium on advancement. And I think that was a lot of the fault of his regime, one of the major mistakes he made. At any rate, though, Carbo was luckier than most. In 85, Cinna turned to Carbo to serve as his consular colleague. Carbo was a good ally to have. He was a dynamic speaker, and he apparently had some cachet with the people who had backed Marius. There does seem to have been a little bit of tension between people who were more for Cinna and people who were more for Marius and his son Marius the Younger. That year, the two consuls concentrated on raising forces that could go to Greece and confront Sulla in order to avoid having Sulla invade Rome and march on the city once again. In 84, Cinna and Carbo once again served as consuls. By this point, it's pretty clear that Cinna regarded Carbo as his right-hand man and his successor if the worst should happen. Well, that same year, the worst did happen, at least so far as Cinna is concerned. Cinna decided that he would lead the newly raised army across the Adriatic to fight Sulla, while Carbo would govern Italy. However, Cinna encountered some bad weather on the way across, and he was killed in a shipwreck, possibly by his own men who were angry, or possibly by the storm itself. It's not entirely clear. At any rate, the survivors were scattered in on the eastern shore of the Adriatic, and Carbo recalled them to Italy, knowing that they no longer had the strength to do any harm to Sulla. The arrangements of 84, at least so far as I'm concerned, make it very clear that Cinna regarded Carbo as his successor and his chief lieutenant. I think that most people in the Cinnan faction accepted that Carbo was the new main guy, but I don't think that his position was as secure as Cinna's had been or as Marius's had been, and that will explain quite a bit of what happens next. Lacking the political skills and record of someone like Cinna, or the military brilliance and reputation of someone like Marius, Carbo needed to find other means with which to build up his own personal prestige and to broaden the support of the faction that he now led. One obvious way to do that was to loosen the restrictions of the Cinnan system on office holding. Many senators were no doubt restless with the fact that their year had passed them to hold certain magistracies. Most senators, if they wanted to be very prestigious, wanted to hold an office at the minimum age requirement, or at least the minimum traditional requirement, since those requirements were not quite set in stone yet. Without that being open, and with the elections being rigged by Cinna, that just wasn't an option, and you can imagine that quite a few nobles got annoyed. In a previous video on Hortensius, I noticed that Hortensius's advancement was delayed by this very system. So Carbo's strategy was simple. He would win over prominent men through offering offices, but he did not fully restore political competition. He merely reached out to people he thought he could win over. For the patrician consul of 83, Carbo arranged for Scipio Asiaticus to be the man, and for the plebeian consulship, he arranged for the new man, Gnaeus Norbanus, to be consul. Norbanus was someone who was completely loyal and had some military skill, or at least experience. And as for Scipio Asiaticus, he is the scion of Rome's most famous patrician family, and there seems to have been a genuine belief among many Romans that the name Scipio had a magical quality to it, and that the gods simply favored Scipii in battle. Of course, we'll see that in the 1st century BCE, that does not seem to have been the case. Both Scipio Asiaticus, spoiler, and one of his descendants, Metellus Scipio, would prove that they were not Scipio Africanus. So they will be the consuls for 83, but in addition to winning over elite supporters, Carbo will need foot sloggers. He'll need men to fill the ranks to face the veteran legions of Sulla, and one way to beat more experienced forces is to have numbers, and Carbo knew exactly how to get those numbers. He engaged in fear-mongering by telling the newly enfranchised Italians, they had just won their rights in the Social War, that Sulla's plan was to revoke their citizenship once he returned to Rome. This had the desired effect, and throughout the civil war that would follow, Carbo would maintain a numerical advantage over Sulla. Another side effect of Carbo's lesser prestige when compared to his predecessor Cinna is that he seems to have been less comfortable trying to exercise direct control of affairs in Rome itself. In fact, he seems to have been eager to get off the scene at just the moment when he expected Sulla to arrive and things to really heat up. One thing that he did do was to persuade the Senate to pass the Senatus Consultum Ultimum against Sulla in either 84 or 83, once it became clear that war was inevitable and that no peace settlement could be reached. I think that it was probable that Carbo tried to negotiate with Sulla, but that Sulla just simply wasn't interested. Either that or both might have had some interest, but neither one found a compromise which was suitable. Carbo decided to take up a proconsular command in Cisalpine Gaul while leaving the defense of what the Romans thought of as Italy in the hands of the two consuls, Scipio Asiaticus and Gnaeus Norbanus. My guess would be that Carbo thought it was possible that there would be an invasion of Cisalpine Gaul, or that he needed to raise troops in the north. It's also very possible that he had good reason to suspect that he was not a very skilled general, and he wanted to get the hell out of the way and hope for the best. Either the magical name of Scipio Asiaticus or the experience of Norbanus might be more useful than his own ability to string a sentence together. In early 83, Sulla landed, and while Sulla's army landed and began to march, there were also uprisings in his favor, most notably the one by Pompey out of Picenum. Gaius Norbanus would meet Sulla and fight at the Battle of Tifata. This was a complete disaster for Norbanus, and he and the remainder of his army were trapped at the city of Capua after the battle. As for Asiaticus, he marched out to fight Pompey. However, Asiaticus's army suffered mass defections to the young Pompey, and this enabled Sulla later to capture and pardon the patrician consul. One effect that had was to make it look like Sulla was the only champion of the patricians. You have Sulla, the most prominent living patrician, meeting and befriending someone who is the scion of the greatest patrician house. This was a major propaganda win for Sulla to capture and pardon Scipio Asiaticus. Carbo, meanwhile, had raised an army in the north, and he marched south. But he did not have any significant actions in 83, except possibly he was able to create enough of a distraction for Sulla that Norbanus was able to effect a breakout from Capua and escape north to join him. But even then, I'm speculating a bit. It's possible that Norbanus just simply gunned for it and managed to break out of a weak point in the blockade around the city. I would like to think maybe that Carbo got in the neighborhood and Sulla had to weaken his line, and that's what gave Norbanus the opening. But I just want to give Carbo at least like one little moment where he was semi-competent as a general, because as we'll see, his overall record in the field is pretty dismal. While Sulla and his allies had made considerable progress in 83, the war had not ended that year, largely due to the sheer numbers that Carbo had on his side. Going into the year 82, Carbo still had a large army, although his numerical advantage had decreased quite a bit, especially as Sulla's army grew due to defections. He still held the city of Rome. He had the Samnites on his side, and they were willing to ride it out with Carbo and his friends, and he also controlled Cisalpine Gaul, or as we call it now, northern Italy. So he had a base, and he still had a fighting chance, at least in theory. In order to try to stem the tide of defections, Carbo arranged to have himself elected as consul again, along with Gaius Marius the Younger. 82 would turn out to be Carbo's last stint as consul. Electing Gaius Marius the Younger as consul was also a means to try to bolster support by invoking the memory of Marius's famous father. However, Gaius Marius the Younger was not his father. The plan for the year was for Carbo to move north into Etruria to defend the area against Pompey and Metellus Pius, while Marius the Younger confronted Sulla. Once again, it would seem that Carbo was banking on the fame of the name of his general to counterbalance Sulla's military ability. So once again, it was a terrible calculation, and shockingly, it didn't pay off. It's intriguing that Carbo gave himself the secondary theater once again, yet I think that it makes sense because Carbo did have the self-awareness to know that he was not a legendary general. Carbo had a numerical edge on young Pompey and thought to overwhelm him, so he sent his cavalry against the young man. However, Pompey was able to trap these horsemen on unfavorable terrain and force them to surrender. So Carbo effectively lost his ability to defend his flanks, supply lines, and to scout. This was incredibly stupid on his part to send an unsupported cavalry force against Pompey. He seems to have badly underestimated the young man. Pompey had, after all, served in his father's camp during the Social War, and he had quite a bit of natural ability. He was also backed up by some of Sulla's troops at this point, so really underestimating Pompey to that extent, or at least pursuing the strategy for whatever reason, was incredibly ill-conceived, and it speaks volumes about just how bad of a general Carbo actually was. As for Marius the Younger, he met Sulla and was completely and totally smashed at the Battle of Scaraportus, losing about 28,000 men in total, most of whom just defected. So I imagine they saw the battle was going poorly and then they just threw down their arms and that was the battle. However, Marius did manage to retain the loyalty of about 7,000 men, and they retreated to the city of Praenesta. The hope was that Carbo would march south and break the siege. Of course, banking on Carbo's generalship was never exactly the best gamble that one could make. Up in Etruria, Carbo looked at the strategic situation. He judged the plight of Marius the Younger, who was besieged at Praenesta, to be hopeless, and instead he decided that his best odds were to retreat to Africa and raise troops there. To get to Africa, however, he would need to cross over via Sicily. It's unclear exactly how many men he was able to take with him, but it does seem that he had some kind of a force. It's also possible that he just took his best friends, acquaintances, and entourage and abandoned his army. Carbo does not seem to have had all that many people with him, but clearly he had some people. He was able to make it to Sicily, but for whatever reason he failed to make it to Africa. And this was over a fairly long period of time, by the way. It's not like he was on the run for just a few weeks. This was a slow-speed chase. Carbo escaped and stayed there for months while waiting for passage. For whatever reason, I guess he didn't bring enough men to simply seize some ships in one of Sicily's ports and go to Africa. Or maybe he didn't receive any support when he got there, and he was a little surprised and demoralized by that. At any rate, in 81, Sulla and his allies had taken Rome, and then Sulla had commissioned Pompey to take 6 legions and 120 warships to hunt down Carbo. Carbo had no way of contesting against that large of a force, and he tried to hide rather than fight, but Pompey was able to find and arrest Carbo. Carbo's end was ignominious in the extreme and completely unworthy of a man who was 3 times consul and one of the principal actors in a civil war. Pompey decided when he captured Carbo to hold a public tribunal in Sicily, which would help create a legal justification for executing a Roman consular. One simply couldn't execute a Roman consular at a whim, and indeed the execution of any Roman senator could have massive political and social blowback if it wasn't done properly. However, while typically Romans would treat any kind of condemned senator with a certain amount of decorum in public, see for example the Catilinarian conspiracy, where Cicero literally led one of the men who was condemned by hand to the place of execution, Pompey had no interest in showing respect to the defeated Carbo. Plutarch tells us that Pompey behaved with uncustomary arrogance toward Carbo and turned the tribunal into a way to publicly humiliate his foe. Although Pompey did this when he was a young man in maybe his early to mid-20s, Plutarch still held it against him and said that it was a morally objectionable action on Pompey's part. We don't know exactly what Pompey said about Carbo or what he allowed others to say, but clearly it was not pretty, and Carbo was forced to take a beating in words before he lost his life. Due to his ultimate failure, Gnaeus Papirius Carbo's place in history is as a foil to greater men who used their victory over him to achieve great things. I suppose you could also argue that he was the epilogue to Marius and Cinna. But at any rate, he ended up having very little significance of his own, at least that went past his own lifetime. In Plutarch's Life of Pompey, Carbo is more or less a foil for young Pompey. Up to that point, the narrative's villain had been Cinna, who had been responsible for Pompeius Strabo's death, and then he died and was replaced by Carbo, whom Plutarch describes as a tyrant yet more senseless than Cinna. And Plutarch is painting with purple prose about how bad Cinna is, so by calling Carbo worse, he is actually really milking how bad Carbo was. As someone who lost the Civil War and as part of a faction that was almost entirely smashed, in later years Carbo attracted no defenders or redeemers. Caesar in many ways would take up the mantle of Marius and Cinna, especially Marius, who was his uncle, but also Cinna to an extent since Cinna was his father-in-law. But, Carbo, Cicero wasn't that concerned with Carbo. Carbo was expendable. That's not a legacy he bothered to defend. Carbo's actions as a tribune in 92 also made it easy for his elite conservative critics to view him as little more than a basic demagogue in the mold of someone like Publius Sulpicius Rufus or Saturninus. And it must be said that Carbo was a really, really, really shitty general. His poor generalship and inability to replace Marius and Cinna as effective leaders played a huge role in ensuring a victory for Sulla and set the stage for all of the changes that Sulla made, which helped to shape the outcome of the last 30 to 40 years of the Roman Republic. So had someone more capable than Carbo been in charge when the Civil War went hot, i.e. the years 83 to 81, Roman history could look a lot different. If Cinna hadn't died in a shipwreck, Roman history could have gone quite a bit differently. But of course we can't know. All we know is that Carbo is a victim of his own failure. So, if you're going to fight a civil war, always remember to win. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.